Hi, hello, and a very warm welcome to my channel. In this video, I'm going to explore this question. Do you need a lawyer to buy a house? Do you need an attorney to buy a house? Now let's face it, buying a house will probably be the largest and most significant purchase you will make in your entire life. It also involves the law of real property, which is unique and raises special issues not present in other transactions. So while you don't need a lawyer to buy a house, it may be beneficial for a number of reasons that I'm going to explore in this video. In the typical home purchase, the seller enters into a brokerage contract with a real estate agent, usually in writing. And when the broker finds a potential buyer, negotiations are conducted through the broker, who most often acts as an intermediary. Now, once an informal agreement is reached, buyer and seller enter into a formal written contract for the sale. The buyer then obtains a commitment for financing a mortgage. Now, title is then searched to satisfy the lender and the buyer. Finally, the property is transferred from the seller to the buyer, and the seller receives the purchase price bargained for in the contract. Now, this seems pretty simple, but without a lawyer, the consequences may be disastrous. Having the help of a lawyer when buying a house can help you avoid some common problems. For example, a seller may sign a brokerage agreement that fails to address a number of legal problems. A seller may sign a brokerage agreement that fails to address a number of legal problems. Now, this happens quite often. Realtors often use standard forms, expecting that they will cover all circumstances or will be easily customizable for unusual circumstances. But really, in the absence of an agreement to the contrary, the seller may become liable to pay a brokerage commission even if a sale does not occur, or to pay more than one brokerage commission. Now, if the agreement allows the seller the right to negotiate on his or her own behalf, for example, you may avoid this problem. A lawyer can explain the effect of multiple listings. He or she can negotiate the rights if that is the realtor's rights if the seller withdraws the property from the market or can't deliver good marketable title. Okay, now the seller should have the advice and guidance of a lawyer when buying a house with respect to a brokerage agreement. Even if the agreement is a standard form, its terms should be explained to the seller and revised if necessary. And an attorney or a lawyer should also determine if the agreement was properly signed. Now, if a lawyer is not needed during the course of negotiations, even if a lawyer is not needed during the course of negotiations, the buyer and the seller each may have to consult with a lawyer to answer important questions such as the tax consequences of the transaction. To a seller, the tax consequences may be of critical importance. For example, the income tax consequences of a sale, particularly if the seller makes a large profit, may be considerable. A lawyer can advise whether the seller can take advantage of tax provisions, allowing for exclusion of capital gains in certain circumstances. Also, your attorney will ask about the purchase agreement, and there are certain questions, specific questions that are very key that your attorney can ask about the purchase agreement, because the purchase agreement is the single most important document in the transaction. Although the standard printed forms are useful, a lawyer is helpful in explaining the form and making changes and additions to reflect the buyer's and the seller's desires. And there are many issues that may need to be addressed in the purchase agreement. And some of the questions that your lawyer may ask about the purchase agreement are, for example, if the property has been altered or there has been an addition to the property, was it done lawfully? What happens if a buyer has an engineer or architect inspect the property and termites, asbestos, or lead-based paint is found? Your lawyer could also ask, what if the property is found to contain hazardous waste? What are the legal consequences if the closing does not take place, and what happens to the down payment? Now, this question raises related questions. For example, will the down payment be held in escrow by a lawyer in accordance with appropriately worded escrow instructions? And how is the payment to be made? Is the closing appropriately conditioned upon the buyer obtaining financing? Now, all these key questions can only be asked by your lawyer in regards to the purchase agreement. Now, most buyers finance a substantial portion of the purchase price for a home with a mortgage loan from a lending institution. And the purchase agreement should contain a carefully worded provision that is subject to the buyers obtaining a commitment for financing. Again, it is important to remember that printed contract forms are generally inadequate to incorporate the real understanding of the buyer and seller without significant changes. In addition, there are many kinds of mortgages that may be available. Mortgage loan commitments and mortgage loan documents are complex. Lawyers can review and explain the importance of these documents to you. Now, after the purchase agreement has been signed, it is necessary to establish the state of the seller's title deed to the property and the finances institutions. Now, generally, a title deed search is ordered from an abstract or title insurance company. And in some states and in outlying areas of others, title insurance is not typical. In such cases, an attorney is essential to review the status of the title deed and render an opinion of the title in lieu of a title policy. Assuming you are in an area where title insurance is customary, a lawyer can help review the title search and explain the title exceptions as to what is not insured and determine whether the legal description is correct and whether there are problems with adjoining owners or prior owners. He or she can also explain the effect of easements and agreements or restrictions imposed by the previous owner and whether there are any legal restrictions which will impair your ability to sell the property in future. Now, the title deed search does not tell the buyer or seller anything about existing and prospective zoning. A lawyer can explain whether zoning prohibits a two-family home or whether planned improvements violate zoning ordinances. Now, the closing of the transaction, the closing is the most important event in the purchase and sale transaction. The title deed and other closing papers must be prepared. Title deed passes from the seller to the buyer, who pays the balance of the purchase price. Now, frequently, this balance is paid in part from the proceedings of a mortgage loan. A closing statement should be prepared before the closing, indicating the debts and the credits to the buyer and the seller. And a lawyer can be extremely helpful in explaining the nature, the amount, and the fairness of closing costs. The deed, the title deed, and the mortgage instruments are signed, and an attorney can assure you that these documents are properly executed and explained to the various parties involved. Now, the closing process can be confusing and complex to the buyer and the seller, and those present at the closing often include the buyer, the seller, their respective lawyers, the title deed closer, that is representative of the title company, an attorney for any lending institution, and the real estate broker. There may also be last-minute disputes about delivering possession and personal property, or the adjustment of various costs, for example, fuel and taxes. And if you are the only person there without a lawyer, your rights may be at risk. Now, perhaps the most important reason to be represented by a lawyer really when buying a house is conflicting interests of the parties. Throughout the process, the buyers and the sellers' interests can be at odds with each other, and even with those of professional professionals involved in the sale. Throughout the process, the buyers and the sellers' interests can be at odds with each other, and even with those of professionals involved in the sale. The broker generally serves the seller, and the lender is obtained by the buyer. Now, both want to see the deal go through, since that is how they will get paid. Neither can provide legal counsel. The respective lawyers for the buyer and the seller will serve only their own client's best interests. So, seeking the advice of a lawyer when buying a house is a very good idea from the time you decide to sell or to buy a home until the actual closing. You don't always need a lawyer to buy a house, but real estate attorneys provide many valuable services and can actually help you save money in the long run or avoid buying the wrong property. So, at the end of the day, you don't need a lawyer to buy a house, but from our discussion in this video, you get the impression, if you read between the lines, you definitely would benefit more by getting a lawyer involved when you are buying a house. Now, if you found this video helpful at all, if you have benefited from the content, please give this video a thumbs up and subscribe to the channel and turn your notification bell on so that you know when I upload a new video. Because if it has to do anything with money, I upload it in this channel, because my goal is to help you to improve in all aspects of your life financially, and in the long run help you to grow your wealth. So subscribe to the channel and turn that notification bell on. Now, thank you folks, and I shall see you in our next video. Bye bye.